let me start with you. Is there anything that you'd like to say preparing for today's meeting?
No, not especially. Just I saw the message from Lisa that came through on the chat. So just to remind folks, if you're interested in presenting at the next workshop in a couple of weeks, please let me and Eric know by the end of this week, and then we'll follow up with you.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, very important. There's you'll notice that the agenda for today is a little on the short side. I do have a couple of presenters for next week already, which is fantastic. But if there's more, would be good to hear. Sorry, 2 weeks would be good to hear from you sooner than later, so that we can plan things out. Today, I know that we will have PG&E presenting on their proposal and how resource counting will work. The ISO has a presentation in this regard as well. And that'll be Bridget Sparks, and NRDC has a presentation that Nick Pappas will be presenting that deals with the issues of resource counting, in particular, I believe, for storage resources and for renewable resources, I think is the main focus of that. You'll notice that those don't take us the full amount of time. There is some time in each of those presentations for some back and forth and discussion, but I will note we put then 55 minutes at the end for Q&A on any of these if there's something that we haven't taught during the presentation. We've also said that if necessary, at 1 o'clock we'll take a lunch break, and then come back at 1:30 and go up to 3 o'clock with any further Q&A if we have it. If we're done with Q&A by 1 o'clock, we will break for the day. We will be done. So that's all that we have on the agenda for today. Let me see if there are any questions before we start into presentations.
I see Vidi from MCE has a hand raised.
Yeah.
There's a question there.
Sure, Vidi, go ahead.
I'm sorry, that was a mistake. I'm going to lower it.
No worries.
Hi, this is Sarah Myers. I can't get on your join the meeting link. I wondered if you could resend a link out. I'm sorry to make you do this. I can give you my email address. Maybe no one else has had this problem.
Lisa, can you help with that?
Yes, I can.
Pardon me?
This is Lisa. Are you only calling right now? I can
not
take
really
your
hearing.
Yeah, I'd just like to remind people to please mute. We're hearing a lot of background noise, a lot of typing. It seems to be very close to the microphone.
Right. My email is ssmyers@att.net. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay. Sarah, we'll try to get something out to you to make sure that you're able to join in. Sorry about that. Any other questions out there?
Probably me. Thank you for your help.
No worries. Any other questions out there before we get into presentation?
I'm sorry, Sarah, could you repeat your email address? There was a lot of similar sounding letters.
I apologize. It's ssmyers@att.net.
Got it.
And it could be me. So thank you for your help. Otherwise, I'll be on the phone. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Last opportunity for any questions on the any housekeeping items.
Yeah, and I guess let's just remind people to use the raise hand function
Thank you.
At the end of each presentation if they have questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And presenters, if there's a point that you want to stop and take questions, let us know that as well. But otherwise, if people can raise hand to be able to get in queue to ask questions, we would very much appreciate that. With that, I believe that Peter is going to be the presenter for PG&E. So Peter, if you want to take it away, go ahead. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can share yours.
Hey, Eric, this is Luke. Peter is actually out on a much-deserved vacation, and so Yama and myself are going to be presenting PG&E. I will share my screen here. It's going.
Can you tell people to go on mute?
Yeah, folks, if you can mute your lines, that was going to help us out greatly, because otherwise it starts to interrupt the speaker and we get broken speech patterns. So please mute your line if you're not speaking. Thank you.
Okay. So my name is Luke Nickerman, and Rhett Kikuama and myself will be covering the PG&E presentation. Before we get started, at PG&E, we always do a safety moment at kind of the beginning of any meeting. You can see there's a lot of kind of things up here on the screen. I'm just going to focus on one that's probably at the top of mind for many people, given that we've finally gotten some rain, and that's just being safe outside in the rain. This morning, my kids ride their scooters to school. And it was just a fine mist this morning, so I told them that we'd go ahead and still ride their scooters. I had kind of forgotten that the yellow pads at the end of sidewalks that a lot of cities are installing, which I kind of looked up. It's good that they are doing this. It's to help the visually impaired. But they can get kind of slick. And so my son probably tried to turn on one of them and then laid out on the sidewalk. And he was fine, he was going slow. And there wasn't a puddle or anything, so he wasn't wet. But just keep in mind if you're out walking, riding bikes or other things, and driving, kind of keep an eye out. And keep in mind if you're walking or riding something, that those things can get slippery. Okay, and jump into the presentation. So PG&E has a few desired outcomes for this particular workshop. One is kind of a common understanding of what the current RA accounting rules are, and so you'll notice that a lot of what we're starting with is just what is the current state, the status quo, what are we using today? And then also getting into how the current rules might work as part of this broader RA reform effort. And then thirdly, we'll get into identifying some factors and issues for some specific resource types. Okay, so in the first two workshops we started with, or one of the first slides was the commission adopted principles. We're putting those up again because we think it's a useful frame of reference to kind of think through the direction that the commission gave us in going through these workshops, and just remind ourselves what are some of the key considerations as we kind of make our way through. And so you'll notice the first three, these are all kind of designed to balance kind of competing issues, right? So we have reliability and costs, energy sufficiency and environmental goals, and then granularity with simplicity and transactability. And so how do we kind of balance all of those as we come up with what might be the final framework? And then fourth, is it implementable in the near term, right? So is it something that could be stood up by 2024? And then lastly, is it durable, and is it something that can be adapted as the grid continues to evolve? Okay, so we have some key objectives for resource accounting in particular. The first one is providing a reasonable measurement of a resource's ability to create energy in particular times of the day. And we have some examples here. For instance, with wind and solar, the frameworks that we've been talking about, there's a need for more than just one value per month for these resources. And so how can we get to something that more fully captures what those resources bring? Addressing capacity needs to charge storage in the future framework. To date, this hasn't been a big issue because there hasn't been as much storage on the system, but we're expecting a lot in the coming years. And so ensuring that we have capacity to charge that is kind of front of mind as well. And then consider and incorporate physical characteristics to the extent possible. Some examples might be hybrid or co-located, for a particular resource type, fixed PV versus tracking PV, etc. And then align with the KAISA's objectives behind the UCAP proposal. I think one of their objectives was to try to get a better estimate of what the resources is providing in terms of reliability. So the feeling is that dovetails nicely with the point that we just covered, which is how can we consider and incorporate physical characteristics as much as possible. And then simplifying the resource counting rules, and creating a framework that allows for easy identification of particular resources value at any time of the year, and doing that in a way that's easy. And then lastly, using the resource counting rules to help inform the final slice of day framework. Okay, so what we have here is a table of the various resource types that we have on the system, how those particular resources are currently valued, and then the NQC, the September NQC in aggregate resources. This presentation will mostly focus on the ones in the red box, although we will at least touch on one of the others as well. And so let's just spend a couple minutes reviewing this. So dispatchable, this is mostly natural gas resources, but also includes biogas, biomass, geothermal, waste to power. That's currently uses a PMAX, and those are, I think everyone knows, by far the largest in terms of the NQC value available on the system. Storage, so PMAX measured over a 4-hour output, and then as we talked about, we're expecting a lot more of this in the coming years. Solar and wind, so both of those use the effective load carrying capability or the ELCC, and you'll note the September NQC for both of these is relatively small. As we'll see, the actual nameplate of those resources is quite a bit larger, and so we'll be getting into that a little bit more in the following slides. Hybrid and co-located. So the current approach for these is using the renewable resources energy to charge the storage. So there's a profile that the Energy Division has created, and you use that to determine how much energy you need to charge the storage in a particular month. And if there's excess energy after you've accounted for that energy to charge the storage, then you apply the ELCC to that excess. And then non-dispatchable, the average generation output during the measurement hours from the previous 3 years, and storage-based hydro. So this was recently changed. This is a monthly exceedance based on market bids from the previous 10 years. And then lastly, imports, which is based on the contracted amount. Okay, so starting with dispatchable. As we talked about, generally, these are natural gas-based resources that aren't energy limited. Dispatchability refers to a dispatchable flag in the KAISA's master file, which is determined by the scheduling coordinator. And then scheduling coordinators also have the option to reduce the RA value from the PMAX during the annual NQC review process. So in terms of thinking about dispatchable from a slice of day perspective, we've identified a number of options that could be considered. The first is just staying with the status quo, or the Pmax. A slight variant of that would be a Pmax, but that also accounts for ambient temperature conditions. And then we have a couple different exceedance options. The first one, based on generation output, this is probably not a good option for dispatchable, just given that they're available, generally always available, but aren't always producing. And so if you're basing it on the generation output, that could be problematic. Nevertheless, we've included it here as one of the options to be comprehensive. But the second exceedance option is something that could be considered. This would be using market schedules or bids, and could also be a good proxy of the value. And then the fifth one, the enforced capacity, or UCAP. Kaisel will be going into more detail in one of the later presentations on that option. Okay, so standalone energy storage. So we talked about how the status quo uses the Pmax measured over a 4-hour output. That's certainly one of the options for for this resource type. We've also included an exceedance based on market schedules or bids. One of the key issues with exceedance for energy storage is that generally it's available when you want to use it, and so if we went with an exceedance route, we would have to be careful to ensure that say an LSE that had been showing it in the evening and then wanted to show it in the morning, it isn't penalized because of how they've been bidding previously as a result of wanting to do that. Some items to consider. So showing storage in a slice of day framework. There's a few important technology characteristics: interconnection, limited charging status, the charge and discharge rate, the energy quantity, etc. But another thing that we want to point out is that we think storage could fit in many different slice designs. And so on the right here, what we're showing is an example framework that uses 4-hour slices. And so you can imagine a 4-hour storage resource easily fits into a 4-hour slice. But what would you do with something like a 6-hour storage resource? The thinking is you could use 4 of the 6 hours full capacity, and then the remaining 2 hours could be spread across another slice. Right? And so the amounts that we have in the gray shade there are actually designed to be kind of a 6-hour battery that's shown for full capacity for that first slice, and then at half capacity for the second slice. And you can imagine a lot of different configurations that where you're doing something similar to that effect. Okay, and then the last bullet here is ensuring sufficient energy to charge storage. We get into that more on the next slide. Okay, so one of the key elements of the slice a day framework was that you would need to show sufficient capacity in other slices to charge storage that an LSE is showing. And so what we have here is an example of how that could work. So we're in this example, storage is being shown in the last 2 slices here, the gray boxes with a blue outline. When you add the two boxes up, it's about 20 gigawatts. But that wouldn't be that would be what you're showing, but that wouldn't actually be the charging requirement because you need to account for efficiency losses. So we've assumed a 20% loss factor, which would give you essentially 24 gigawatts that you would need to account for in some other slice or slices. So on the left, what we've done is outlined the boxes in the other slices where you have excess capacity. and when you aggregate those up, you get about 29 gigawatts, which is which would be sufficient to charge to charge the 24 gigawatts that you have in terms of the need. Okay, moving on to solar and wind. So we talked a little bit about ELCC. I'm going to get into some more detail here. So the current approach develops a monthly RA value at the aggregate level for solar and wind. It uses an average-based calculation to do that, and it doesn't distinguish between different technology types. So, for instance, fixed or tracking PV, it gets one value regardless of whether it's fixed or tracking, and doesn't distinguish in terms of between geographic locations, which is particularly important for wind. One important thing to note is that it is required by current statute, and so that's something that would need to be discussed at some point. Some other items to consider. So ELCC is dependent on the aggregate portfolio of resources, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to administer and predict as we get different configurations of resource types. I think everyone's aware that at least for the last several updates to ELCC, the value has declined with each update, and and it looks like with the IRP forecasting that will continue to decline in the future, which makes it difficult to predict how much value you're going to get from those resources. ELCC is also challenging to fit in under a slice of day framework, where you need that more granular level. Certainly throughout the day, right? Having more values throughout the day is really going to be one of the key elements of the slice of day framework. And then you also have kind of the individual resource dynamic, where any given resource might be under or overperforming relative to the aggregate level. And so, kind of looking at all of these various considerations, we felt like there was a tremendous increase in complexity and administrative burden associated with continuing with ELCC. And so that was one of the primary reasons that PG&E proposed to shift to an exceedance-based framework for the slice of day. Okay, so some background on exceedance. So exceedance is currently used for hydroelectric resources and was previously used for solar and wind. It can account for resource-specific performance. It's a more reasonable measure of a resource's ability to produce energy during different times of the day. And it can be chosen based on a data-driven risk tolerance and balanced with kind of a planning reserve margin. So, if you choose an exceedance level that's a little bit more conservative, maybe you have a smaller planning reserve. If you choose one that's a little bit more generous, then maybe you have a larger planning reserve. And then it's also much easier to update, and so you'd be able to update it more frequently based on latest data. Okay, and so here we're going to get into an example of how exceedance is actually calculated. And so on the left here, we have 2018 CAISO solar data for hour ending 18. So that's 30 observations, one for each day in September 2018. And we've ranked these from lowest to highest in terms of the aggregate megawatts. And then we've calculated percentiles. So if you look at the middle box here, the 50th percentile equals the 50% exceedance level, and it's essentially right in the middle, 4,869 megawatts. We've also provided a 25% exceedance level and a 75% exceedance level, right? And starting with the one on the top, the 25% exceedance level, right? This is the larger number, the more generous. You use a 75% percentile to calculate that exceedance level. And then the one on the bottom, the more conservative, this is the 75% exceedance. You're using a 25th percentile to calculate that. Going to the table in the middle, so you can kind of track from the 58% exceedance level, the 4,869 megawatts, over to our ME18 in the middle table, where we've provided the exceedance level for each hour in September 2018 at the 50th percent exceedance level. And so you can see, you know, a profile that you would expect, right? You have kind of a zero value in the middle of the night when the sun's not shining. The sun comes up, the values increase pretty rapidly. You have several hours in the middle of the day of kind of peak output, and then the values decline in the evening. And then we've included the ELCC value here for comparison purposes, and you know, essentially the current framework kind of assumes that ELCC value is available for all 24 hours. And so you kind of end up with a situation where you have, in some hours, a much smaller ELCC value than really, you know, than what is actually available. And then other hours you have a value that's much higher. And so, the current framework really tries to address this through the MCC buckets. And so I think a lot of people are familiar that, you know, with those buckets, and that solar and wind is included in bucket 4. But there's kind of a restriction in that bucket, which says that the showings for bucket 4 need to include at least 56% of the resources as 24-hour resources. And so you're really limited in terms of what you can show for solar and wind to kind of that remainder, right? So the 44% remainder would be what you'd be able to show for solar and wind. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and turn over the next slides to Rhett.
Thanks, Luke. Can folks hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, so the next important resource type to consider are hybrid and co-located resources. And so at the current time, as you saw on the previous slide, it's pretty difficult to understand how many megawatts of these resource types exist based on the current NQC list. However, there is a general assumption that there will be increased use of these resource types over the coming years. So, you know, as such, it's pretty critical to develop counting rules that provide a reasonable measurement of these resource types contribution to the system. And so, very quick background. So last year, the CPUC and CAISO adopted slightly distinct definitions for hybrid and co-located resources. And so you'll see on the slide for hybrid at the CPUC, it's defined as 2 or more resources, one of which is a storage component located at a single point of interconnection with a single CAISO resource ID. At the CAISO, it's defined as a generating unit with a unique resource ID at a single point of interconnection, with components that use different fuel sources or technologies. For co-located resources, at the CPUC, it's defined as 2 or more resources, again, one of which is a storage project that is located at a single point of interconnection with 2 or more CAISO resource IDs, and then CAISO, a generating unit with a new unique resource ID that is part of a generating facility with other generating units. So at a high level, there are differences between the definitions. As you can see, one requires hybrid and co-located to be made up of an energy storage component, while the other does not have this requirement. In addition, one set of definitions applies to resources that receive the ITC, and are being charged by the on-site renewable resource. That's the CPUC's definition, while the other set of definitions does not necessarily make this distinction. So there are likely larger questions about different configurations and example, while the ITC constraints exist today, they may not in the future. So it is reasonable to expect that these definitions will have to evolve as well. Next slide. Okay, there it is. Okay, so unlike the existing counting rules for solar and wind resources that apply an ELCC factor to the nameplate, the current counting rules for hybrid and co-located resources are fairly much a multi-step process. And so given that these counting rules were or are fairly new, PG&E thought it would be helpful to kind of review them with all parties. And so from one of the prior slides, I think you saw that Luke mentioned the QC is made up of really two components, the renewable resources energy to charge storage, and an ELCC factor that's applied to the excess energy. So for purposes of this, let's focus on the first component. And so what happens is a daily production profile for each month is used to determine how much energy output can be expected from the renewable resource. In this case, it's a solar resource. If there is sufficient energy to charge the energy storage, then the storage is given its full RA value, which at the current time is at its Pmax. If there is not sufficient energy to charge the energy storage, then the storage is given the value of what it can discharge based on that resource's output. So now we focus on the second component. If there is excess energy from the solar or wind, after fully charging that energy storage component, then the excess energy is then converted back to a capacity value, and the ELCC factor is applied. So you can sort of see this within the second graph on the right, where a portion of the solar's output on the top of the curve is being used to fully charge the storage, which is represented by the orange line, and then any of the remaining energy is then used to serve the grid, and that's the energy under the solid yellow line. Next slide, Luke. Okay, so as folks may recall from the definition slide, hybrid resources are made up of one resource ID, and co-located are made up of multiple, two or more resource IDs. So taken together with the previous slide, what happens is the individual components are either added together and given to the single resource ID, which is under the hybrid framework, or I'm sorry, the hybrid resource counting rules, or given to each applicable resource ID under the co-located counting rules. I'll also add that the aggregate of the components, whether it's under hybrid or co-located, remains subject to the interconnection limit at the CAISO. So again, in considering counting rules for these resources, the counting rules apply to distinct and assumed configurations, and really the definitions that were on the previous slide. However, there could be multiple configurations, which could be with or without charging restrictions, made up of different underlying resource types, AC, DC coupled, and high efficiency or low efficiency losses. So one thing that we've kind of would like parties to consider, or one of the many things parties would have to consider in developing these counting rules, are which configuration should be the focus, as it will be probably nearly impossible to really kind of focus and develop counting rules for all of these different configurations that could show up on the grid. Also, given the different configurations, how can parties facilitate the information exchange process with the Commission's Energy Division in calculating the QC values? So some information may be within the CAISO's master file. There may be other means by which this information needs to be communicated. Additionally, one other thing to consider is, does it make sense to have similar methodologies for both resource types, or should there be differences between the two? given the physical characteristics or operational characteristics of these hybrid and co-located. So I'll add, so I missed the first bullet point under the items to consider. So that refers to the proposed framework in which LSCs that have storage would need to show sufficient capacity to charge the storage. So something that Luke was touching on. So it's really ensuring that a hypothetical quote co-located portfolio of solar and energy storage has sufficient energy. So for example, an LSC today can show a portfolio of solar and storage resources that are quote not co-located and receive a higher value relative to an LSC that shows a portfolio of quote co-located resources. So this may not always make sense, especially given that these resources operate in a similar manner. So next slide, Luke. Okay, and the last resource type we wanted to consider is imports. So PG&E's current thinking is that non-resource specific resources may not need to change their existing counting rules, but potentially resource specific imports could be reflective of the resource types counting rules. For example, a resource that is a resource specific solar import would be applied an exceedance based methodology similar to an in-state solar. And then the other thing to consider with imports is that how it overlaps with a slice of the framework. So right now the current products that are primarily transacted come under these three that we've noted. So there's an all hours or 24/7 import product. There's a high load hours, which covers hours ending 7 through 22, and then a low load hours, which is hours ending 1 through 6, and 23 to 24. And so these hours or these products, I'm sorry, may not align with the slices, at least at first, but may need to be considered in a final framework and how they overlap with how they're transacted in the market. Next slide. Okay, and lastly, Luke somewhat touched on this. So we recognize the needs determination work stream is probably slated to consider how to set the appropriate planning reserve margin or PRM, but there could be some overlap with resource counting rules. So currently the planning reserve margin really captures or only captures the operating reserves, forced outages, and a load forecasting error. However, as the resource mix becomes more reliant on resources that are variable in nature, we may need to consider whether and how a variation in resource counting rules could be or should be part of the PRM. So as an example, a higher exceedance level could result in a lower PRM, and a low exceedance level may need to result in a higher PRM. So I'll stop there. I think that's the end of the slides, and I guess we can open up for questions.
Okay, so we do have some raised hands, and there were some questions in the chat. Let me go through the questions in the chat real quickly. First, so Jose Torre Bueno, wow, I can't speak today. When charging, why is the limit the reserve margin and not the actual demand? The reserve margin is not being used, and if it's needed, the battery charging can be stopped. I think this was back in the early parts on.
Yeah, and I think I've answered my own question, so I'll drop that one.
Okay, thank you. All right, there was some back and forth about the 80% versus 85%, and I think the gist of it that I get out of it is, should we be using a resource-specific efficiency rate such that there is incentive to build more efficient batteries? That's kind of what I take out of the discussion that was going on. But either Kathleen or Carrie, Kathleen Colbert or Carrie Bentley, if there's anything else you'd like to add to that, please speak up.
This is Kathleen. I think that's a pretty good takeaway, Eric. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Oh, you got it. So this is Carrie Bentley. Yeah, that was the takeaway. I also had my hand raised on another topic if now would be the appropriate time.
Yeah, go ahead, Carrie.
Thanks. I was just wondering, it seems like, and maybe I missed it, and if so, I apologize, but did you guys cover demand response? Demand response counting is particularly controversial and is part of the MCC buckets as of today. So I was wondering if you could cover that as well as the other resources. Thanks.
Hey, Carrie, this is Red. So we haven't covered it, at least within this workshop, and we recognize there's a kind of separate work stream that's being led at the CEC that may consider sort of how the new counting rules would fit into a slice of day framework. But I think it's something that we can sort of add, ensure that there is a consistent, or at least it is being considered and how it fits in this framework.
Okay, thank you. That would be helpful. I wasn't aware of the CEC effort, so I'll go to that process and look it up as well.
Okay, thank you, Carrie. So I'm just going to go in the order that they're listed on my screen here, which appears to be alphabetical because I don't know who raised their hand first. So I apologize for that, but we'll get through everybody nonetheless. Kathleen, I see that you have your hand raised as well.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. And thanks for the presentation. I did want to kind of share a little bit more context. I think, Eric, you did get the right takeaway from our back and forth, but I had a couple other suggestions and things I wanted to level set and kind of crowdsource on the topic of storage. And I do think that we need to be very conscious that each storage asset has its own physical operating parameters, and that a part of developing these assets includes negotiations on warranties, developing the specifics that are in warranties that apply some of these physical parameters. The actual operations of the storage asset, I don't believe we can apply heuristics the way that I'm seeing in some of the presentations. The specific round trip efficiency is going to be one of the main drivers on the number of hours that are capable to be discharged. And, one thing I hear a lot is I hear people, when we think about the storage limitations, kind of say that they're, duration limited. I don't particularly love calling storage 4-hour storage. I prefer to define my storage assets as our megawatt capacity and our megawatt hour capacity. And I really think everything starts with your megawatt hour capability, and you get to your megawatt from there, right? But your megawatt hour capability, we are energy limited. We are not cycle limited. So one of the things that I sometimes see in these assumptions of what's needed to charge or where the storage could be shown is an assumption that this is a 4-hour battery that has a single cycle. And while that may have been true at some time in this industry, I don't know that I believe that is a good rule of thumb anymore, especially with the large scale battery energy storage systems that we're seeing come on in the last year and into the future. The round trip efficiency is going to drive how many hours. So it's not really, and I think of, let's just say that an asset has like somewhere around 88% round trip efficiency. And I'm doing rough numbers here, so forgive me, but that's around 11 hours of discharge capability across the day. And it also doesn't have to be continuous. It can be non-contiguous, right? And that is an important, so I think the fact that the round trip efficiency really drives how many hours can be discharged, and those discharge hours do not need to be contiguous, as well as, I give the example of 11 because that doesn't fit cleanly into 3 slices, but 4 hours, but it can be discharged and it can provide reliability value for those, let's say, based on this round trip efficiency example, 11 hours. And I do think that storage should be looked at more flexibly this way. And I really encourage the group to think about the fact that each storage asset has its own physical parameter, can provide discharge during the hours across the day, not necessarily contiguous based on that. And while I know depth of discharge has not been raised, I think that is an important factor, that if we're going to even bring up round trip efficiency, then depth of discharge needs to be in the conversation as well. Happy to continue working on this, but just wanted to raise some thoughts from a storage developer and operator perspective.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. Okay,
Eric, can I maybe ask a question on that topic? Because it was kind of part of the slides about facilitating sort of the information exchange. I mean,
yes.
Are these characteristics captured anywhere within any market systems? Or, I mean, how would folks be able to be aware of this as it impacts any potential counting rules?
This is Kathleen. And I'm happy to encourage Bridget to jump on as well from the CAISO, but round trip efficiency is registered with the CAISO. It is a specific resource characteristic that is on file. Our maximum stored energy capability, that megawatt hour capability after round trip efficiency, is also stored and registered with the CAISO. And I just emphasize that's after RTE is accounted for. And that's a really important market functionality because the CAISO, when it looks at your charge schedules, applies the round trip efficiency on file to then be able to calculate what our running state of charge is at any point in time. All of these parameters kind of feed into each other. I will say that I don't believe the depth of the discharge is on file right now, but I, encourage Bridget to correct me. And I also think that more conversations are needed because, for example, you can overbuild. So you have a nameplate that's greater than your point of interconnection at your site, which can account for that depth of discharge by allowing you to have additional energy behind the point of interconnection so that you're not, threatening any of your warranties, et cetera. Those are just some of my quick answers, and happy to see if Bridget wants to clarify anything.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, that's helpful.
So I'm going to continue down the list here, and if Bridget wants to queue back up, that would be fine as well. The next one I see on the list is Doug Carpa.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Yeah, I just thank you very much for the presentation. I just had a couple considerations, I think, for people to bear in mind as we consider particularly principle 2 around keeping environmental values and goals in mind, and then also really future-proofing this as we move to a more heavily renewable and storage-focused grid. I would point particularly to recent work that was done in the IRP proceeding at the Energy Commission, which I think shed some really interesting light from kind of a natural experiment doing reliability analyses of renewable resources and comparing that to the same NQC value of gas, which basically resulted, the result from that is that ELCC values for renewables are too low. Those are underestimates of the actual reliability contribution, because if you have a 1-for-1 swap, you end up with a less reliable system with an equivalent amount of gas, which I think we really should be keeping in mind that going forward, we need to move to a system that actually is technology neutral and isn't giving failing to account for issues that some technologies may face while accounting for the same issues with other technologies that'll lead to an implicit subsidy for some resources over others. So I think that's be worth people to go over and look at. And I think there was a report recently that came out in IRP that includes some of this information, and then there was a presentation on August 30th on that. And the second point to sort of keep in mind as we move forward, for the lawyers in the audience, I would go take a look at the actual ELCC statute next of it, because there, I heard the notion that there may be statutory problems here, but one key aspect of that is that ELCCs is not defined in statute, which potentially we may choose a different methodology and call it ELCC and say, no, this is the right way to make these currencies of reliability equivalent. That is the new effective load carrying capacity methodology. So lest people have fears about that, I think there may be a relatively straightforward legal approach there.
Doug? Moving on to next in line here, and Carrie, I do see that your hand is re-raised, but I'm taking the others who were in line before that, assuming that you've re-raised your hand. So I will get to you. Alan Meck is the next one I see.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
All right, Alan Meck from SDG&E. I had a question about the exceedance methodology. So what would happen if, say, a unit went on forced outage? It seems like that would drop your exceedance value quite a lot for just 1 month, potentially, out of the year. And would that lead to problems in how you procure to meet your portfolio requirements, where some units are suddenly dropping off with their exceedance value dramatically 1 year for 1 month, and then another unit drops off dramatically for another month the next year? It seems like this creates an instability problem.
Luke, do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
Yeah, why don't you start?
Okay. Yeah, Alan, I think that's a good point. So that is one thing to consider as part of the exceedance. Do you weight certain years more heavily, or do you sort of weight them all equally? And of course, the number of years that is used, you could that forced outage could influence the calculation. So it would impact it if it's a forced outage, and depending on duration, could lower it. And so it is an item as far as some of the parameters that we would want to define within setting an exceedance methodology.
So how would you try and correct for that? Would you maybe look back more years to have more data to get more of a reliable view of the resource's performance capability?
There's a few ways. So I'm aware that when I guess QC values were being based on generation output, and there was forced outages, that there were proxy values being created to fill in those, I guess, forced outage values. So that is one way. Alternatively, you could sort of just eliminate or not account for those within the overall data stack. So I think there's different ways to sort of account for them, and there's probably trade-offs between each one.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Next one on the list is Paul Nelson.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson on behalf of CPUC. Just do a quick sound check. People can hear me okay?
Yep, go ahead, Paul.
So I just got two issues. One, I just wanted to follow up with a question that Carrie Bentley had mentioned about demand response. Yes, there is a workshop being managed by the CEC, the Energy Commission, to look at that. However, they haven't explicitly looked at slice of day. One of the issues is the commission order, the CPUC order that established that working group was looking for an implementation for a 2023 compliance year. However, the conclusion of this working group is looking for a 2024 compliance year. So we've got a bit of an alignment problem there. But one of the things I wanted to comment on in terms of the slice of day, in terms of what megawatts do you need in this RA program? And while both exceedance and ELCC are expressed in megawatts, they're fundamentally very different. I mean, the exceedance is looking at a contribution to serve load measure, while ELCC is looking at a contribution to cause a change in a loss of load expectation in a reliability model. And so in particular time periods, you can get drastically different results. And a quick example I would try to show is at noontime, solar would have a lot of contribution to meet load. But because of the high amounts of solar, if you tried to do an ELCC value at noon, you would get 0. And so one thing I think in this process of slice of day is figuring out what exactly do you need in this RA accounting under the slice of day. Is it a load contribution? Is it a contribution to reliability, or is it something else?
Thanks, Paul. That's helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. The next up that I have is Tom Beach. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I'm here representing SEIA and the Large Scale Solar Association. I was involved extensively in RA issues when Exceedance was used 10 plus years ago for wind and solar. And one of the lessons that we learned when a 70% exceedance was used is that to the extent that the exceedance value is a lot greater than 50%, you get into significant issues with the sum of the RA exceedance values for individual projects will be a lot less than the exceedance value for the whole portfolio. In other words, if you're using like a 70 or 75% exceedance, you can lose a lot of capacity that's available kind of through portfolio effects. If you're using more like a 50% exceedance, more like the average or the median, then that's a lot less of a concern. And because there will the portfolio, there will not be basically the sum of the averages will be much closer to the average of the whole portfolio. So I think as people think about what level of exceedance should be selected, that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think we also think that the selection of the exceedance value should consider what the resource is being used for, and as well as the relative availability of the resource. For example, if we're looking at the middle of the day where and there is a significant amount of excess energy on the system, then it strikes me that for those hours, certainly an exceedance like 50% is probably appropriate and adequate. I think the question is the hours of the day that are near the net load peak, where we're looking more at providing adequate capacity to meet that peak. That's where I think there are more questions about whether you should use an exceedance that exceeds 50%. But those are some things I think I'd urge people to think about.
Thank you, Tom. The next that I have is Sergio.
Good morning, everyone. This is Sergio Huenes with the California Energy Storage Alliance. So first, I wanted to ask a clarifying question. I see here in the slides, in the topic of standalone energy storage, I believe it's slide 8. Yeah, in slide 8, it says on the right, it says 6-hour storage could fit into 2 4-hour slices, one at full capacity. The remainder could fit into another slice at 50% of its capacity. So under this case, how would the must offer obligation look like for that second slice? Be at half the capacity for all the time? Would it be at full capacity, but it will have a limit on the number of hours that, let's say, you bid, and once you're discharged, that full capacity for 2 hours, then you have no longer a must offer? Have you guys given any thought to that? So that's a clarifying question. And the second comment / question I wanted to make has really to do with what Kathleen was mentioning before about how different storage assets will have different needs and operational characteristics. Generally, what we've been seeing is that a lot of resources have already considered, mainly hybrid and co-located resources, of course, have already considered, for example, their round-trip efficiency when thinking about how to size their generation that is paired to them. So I wanted to put that out there sort of on how you guys might be thinking of incorporating this into the accounting, since we're seeing a very a clear trend towards more like all-in-one storage and charging solutions even in front of the meter, and how that might already be taken into account in the engineering of the projects. I'll keep it there, brief and short. Thanks.
Hey, Sergio, I might have to defer to Peter. He's more familiar with some of the must offer obligation rules.
Yeah, this is Peter Griffiths. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, Sergio, for the most part, in terms of the way we're thinking about storage, is that the limits on the storage are basically going to be the amount of energy that can be provided for the full slice. And so if you have a battery that can have a maximum output for 6 hours, and you have a 4-hour slice, essentially it can have a maximum output for that full 4-hour slice, and then it has also energy capability to be counting in another slice. And it can then count in another slice for whatever their energy capability is. In terms of the must offer obligation, we're not trying to do anything with the must offer obligation or when it runs out of energy in the way it's operated. The RA exercise is very much a planning exercise, and therefore it doesn't really take into account sort of how it actually gets operated. That's up to the way the ISO runs its energy market.
Okay, so quick question here. What I'm hearing you say is this would be more for an accounting purpose then.
Correct.
In an accounting purpose, for one slide, you're valued at your full 4-hour output. And then in the other one, you're valued at whatever is remaining. But in a normal day, the resource will still have 24/7 must offers at its full Pmax, and it's going to manage its charge and discharge through its bids.
Correct.
Okay. Thanks for that clarification.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Peter, this must be a wonderful vacation.
It is.
The next on the list that I see is Carrie. It looks like you've got your hand raised again. Is this a follow-up or is this?
Yeah, just a quick additional point. So first, I did type into the chat my thoughts about exceedance methodology, but I won't repeat that here. I had a point about solar and wind counting. It seems like in the framework and then with the counting rules, solar and wind are being treated fairly similarly, but they have a very different impact on grid reliability. Out-of-state wind in particular, or wind in Southern California, has different contributions to reliability during the peak than solar. And I'm wondering whether perhaps we could think about not just physical, your slide that said, strong consideration of physical differences, but also locational differences, because I do think they have a very different, duration across the day.
Yeah, Carrie, we intended to include locational as well, right? There's technological differences, and I think we had pointed out like fixed PV versus tracking. But you're absolutely right. From a wind perspective, the geographic difference is a big consideration.
Okay, that's great to hear. Thank you.
So I will ask folks if you could, after you've finished with your question, if you can lower your hand again, that will help me out greatly in going through this list. I see Kathleen it looks like you're back in queue.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. As I wanted to say thanks, Sergio, and he said something that made me realize that another point that I thought would be helpful to raise is this idea of how developers are trying to manage these types of limitations on storage. And I think the hybrid co-located is a good example, or a closed system. But another example, let's say just standalone storage, and it's really critical that these parameters are, I'll say I think of them as on the nameplate, not on the point of interconnection amount for the project. And just for those who may not be as familiar, the POI is what is generally at the max, that's kind of setting that NQC. So maybe I'll just refer to that as it's kind of equivalent to the net qualifying capacity, but it's what the point of interconnection is at that point is setting what can be up to can be setting the NQCs. That is what is eligibly sold to an RA contract, but there's nameplate, and I think I mentioned this behind the point of interconnection. That's really important because that is a mitigation tool and a management tool that can be used even if we're talking about standalone, is to overbuild to ensure that what you are selling you can deliver. And so the nameplate is different. And so when we talk about a lot of these parameters, I just want to reemphasize that they impact the nameplate. They don't impact what has necessarily been sold. So we need to be very specific and precise when trying to apply those parameters on individual projects. And just re-emphasizing, I just want to say that a 4-hour storage in this graphic here, you're saying it fits into a single slice. My expectation is a 4-hour storage fits into at least 2 slices and a portion of a 3rd slice. And if you were to force it to be contiguous. But so I just really want to emphasize that a single cycle per day is not a realistic, or should not be a realistic assumption anymore. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. So I know that we are behind schedule by a bit, but I'm okay with that because we had the follow-up Q&A for 55 minutes at the end. Here's what I'm going to do. I've got 3 more questions because I myself have my hand up, even though it's not shown, because I know I have my hand up and I was just going to go last. So I'm going to take the questions from Barbara, from Noah, and then I've got a couple of my own, and then we're going to go to the next session. And if there's anybody after that, we'll do it as the follow-up towards the end. So Barbara, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll be quick. I want to follow up on what Paul said. This is Barbara Barkovich for, I guess unfortunately still for Colocated. And that is that in the Energy Commission driven process having to do with QC for demand response, the Energy Commission has been operating from the place of not thinking about slice of day. And we think it should, because first of all, we're not sure that the Energy Commission driven results are going to be in time for 2023 and may very well not be available until for operational use until 2024. And so the idea that, I know PG&E said, well, that's being dealt with elsewhere. We're trying to get it dealt with elsewhere, but it doesn't mean it's going to happen. So we do think there needs to be some degree of further coordination with respect to the QC for demand response going forward. We don't want it to slip through the cracks, essentially. And then I'm done.
Thank you, Barbara. And I will just add, I don't find it unfortunate at all that you're from Colocated, but I'm not sure that's the way that you meant it. In any event, Barbara, thank you. I appreciate your input. Noah.
Hey, this is Noah Tom from Middle River Power. And Erica, I'll ask a question. I'll ask these sort of 2 questions, and if you think they're better for the later Q&A, I can wait for that as well. So I'll ask, PG&E, Luke, not Peter, because he's supposed to be on vacation, whether or not they have thought about sort of this chicken or the egg problem, in the sense of we're thinking about methodologies and whether or not that needs to be pegged based on a requirement of seasonality, number of slices, and so forth, because there may be different methodologies that would be better suited for for 6 slices, 4 slices, 2 slices, what have you, or 24 slices. And the same thing goes for seasonal. So have you guys given some of that thought?
So no, the question is, have we thought of it within a specific slice of day framework?
Yeah, so like, because we haven't pegged down or decided on how many slices or seasons, and therefore it's maybe a little bit more difficult to think about what the different optionalities as you presented as well for all the resources, right? If you go larger slices, you may find a different methodology to be used to be better and more appropriate versus something that has a smaller hour slice. Sort of a higher level of thought.
Yeah, exactly. And I think one of our core objectives was was to use kind of the resource counting rules to inform the design, right? And like you said, so we don't have kind of a locked in, from PG&E's perspective at least, here's our proposal, this is how we think the slice framework should work. And that's partly because, a lot of these things are kind of interactive. And so, we're also kind of looking at how do the accounting rules, how would they kind of best work in a framework, and what does that lend itself to? So, we've talked about kind of updating. We presented straw proposals at the last workshop. We've talked about kind of iterating on those. I think you will see kind of future iterations in some of the future workshops. But you're absolutely right. And the accounting rules will have a big impact, and that's partly why we don't have kind of a finalized design, I guess, at this point.
Yeah, that's pretty fair. I'm wondering, trying to get a tease out of you whether or not you think it's more which has higher priority, sort of in the scheme of things. Of we need to get down to a sort of a set of requirements first, sort of set that down, and then design the accounting rules for that, or design the accounting rules and then set the requirements to accommodate for the accounting rules, which is more, I guess, more important, or in that sense.
That's a big question. I don't know that I know at this point. And Rad, feel free to jump in if you have a strong feeling one way or the other. I think part of the thinking, right, in putting together the slice of day proposal initially was, how do we best utilize the kind of mix of resources that we currently have and are going to have in the future, right? And so, the resource counting piece is pretty essential. Whether that should come first, I don't know or not.
Yeah, Noah, I think those are good questions and good things to consider. We didn't necessarily see them as serial decisions. They'd have to be done in parallel. And so I think, that is definitely one of the challenges about setting up or developing a final framework, because we do have to consider how they overlap and impact each other.
Yeah, and I will say that looking at, I think it was your energy storage slide, maybe slide 8 again, it seems like, at least in maybe, and I'm guessing here, or jumping at conclusions here, that, the ability to utilize at a later slice for half the NQC value, it seems to suggest some type of optionality for LSCs to either buy, sell, or commit resources on a per slice basis, rather than sort of be more definitive and more strict about it can sort of either transactability or other aspects of that. And so this is very flowing, right, of what the design can look like. So anyways, I am done. Thanks for your time.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to ask again, if folks who have finished questions, if you can lower your hand, that would be greatly appreciated. If not, and I mean this in a non-threatening way, I will lower it for you. Sorry, I couldn't figure out a better way to say that. Dariush, I do see that your hand has been raised. I had committed that I was going to take that set of questions and then the one of my own that I had, and then I was going to defer the rest of them until the later afternoon when we have the follow-up on this to be able to get onto the other presentations. So I hope you don't mind. Hopefully you will be on for that later portion. So real quick, Luke, the questions that I had, batteries, I see that you have methods to account for them in longer slices, et cetera. I assume then that you're going to have some sort of a test that says I can't count these in consecutive slices for their Pmax. So if it's a 4-hour battery, I can't do that.
Cell phone on file is great. 967. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, Eric. So
hang on a second, Luke. If you can mute their lines, I'm hearing some background noise. Sorry, Luke. Go ahead.
Yeah, Eric. So our thinking there is, so if you have a storage resource like the example here, right, like a 6-hour resource, and you have a 4-hour slice design, right, that you would be able to show it in consecutive slices, right, to address that issue that it just doesn't fit nicely into one slice. But to the extent that you have, let's say, a 4-hour resource, right, that there would be some kind of limitation in the showing model that limits you from being able to show that consecutively.
Okay.
So you have to wait like one period to then show it again.
Okay, and I think that's fair. It raises the complexity a bit, but I don't think it's undoable, quite frankly. But it does raise something that Kathleen spoke about that I'm curious of. So you had the test in there to see whether or not there was enough excess energy to be able to charge those batteries, and now you have a temporal issue associated with that. So is there also going to be a test then to say that between the period when I discharge the battery last and I discharge it next, that I have to have enough energy in those other intervening hours to be able to do that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Eric. I don't know that we've kind of come to a conclusion on that yet, and so that might just be something that we have to kind of think about a little bit more and then get back to you.
Okay, thank you. And then the final question that I have for you is that you've got this excess energy at points in time, and it's largely based upon the fact that you're having to meet the worst hour of that particular slice that you end up with excess energy. But that may not be the period of time that I need that excess energy to charge a battery, or I may not want to show additional because of the obligations that I gain from that to be able to show that amount of energy. Have you thought about transactability of incremental energy? Is there the possibility to say, look, I know it's going to be on your showing because you need to meet that peak of that particular slice, but it gives you a whole lot of excess energy during the rest of that slice that I really need to charge my battery. And rather than me show an additional resource, which is going to be above and beyond what the system needs, can I just transact that energy component of it?
Okay, so is the question that can you transact energy above the requirement, or are you talking about the energy below the requirement in the hours in which the forecast isn't equal to the requirement?
Yeah, so if you go back a couple of slides, you had the boxes showing the excess energy to be able to charge. Yeah, that one. It's those boxes, right? So I may have a situation where my boxes are insufficient to charge my battery. And the only way then that I can take care of that is to show more, but that means that I'm going to exceed even the worst hour of that slice, right? And that means that unless we move over to UCAP, I've got RA-AIM issues associated with that and replacement and substitution obligations that I don't really like. And so assuming that none of that goes away, I probably don't really want to show that. But at the same time, there may be somebody else who has excess energy that is sufficient to charge my battery. Can I transact that energy, that basically that box that somebody has?
Yeah, so, I mean, that gets into kind of the bigger transactability discussion, right? And you know, in Edison's presentation last week in the hourly design, one of the key components of their presentation was that it's a bundled product, right? And so you wouldn't be able to transact at the individual hour level. I think with kind of the 4-hour slice or larger slices, it's still kind of an open question. We haven't come down on that issue one way or the other at this point. And I think it's partly that we think there needs to be more discussion about the transactability.
Okay. Can someone remind me, 'cause I just don't remember the schedule of workshops. Is there a workshop specific to transactability?
So we're in the resource counting right now. So we have 2 on resource counting, and then we have need determination and allocation. And I think our thinking, at least, was that transactability would be part of those 2 workshops.
Okay. All right. Then I will raise it there. Thank you very much, Luke. Okay, I am going to stop questions here on this because we are over time on this. Again, if you've got further questions on this, we will have some follow-up at the end. Like I say, we do have until 3 o'clock. That's what this was scheduled to. If it means we need to take a lunch and come back, we will do that. But in the meantime, I would like to go ahead and move on to the ISO presentation. So Bridget, if you are ready to present, go ahead and do so.
All right, let's see if I can figure out how to share on Teams.
It's the little arrow in the upper right. Got it?
Okay, so it's like the arrow and it's like open share tray, and then nothing's populating.
I tell you what, Bridget, if you can't get it to work, I do have the presentations. I would be happy to pull it up and share it on my screen. I will just have to flip through the pages for you. So
if you could, it's not coming up for me. So
let me just find your presentation real quick and I will bring that up.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, you should be seeing it now.
There we go. Perfect. Alrighty, so today the CAISO would like to present an overview of our unforced capacity evaluation proposal. So this is a proposal that we've workshopped extensively in our own stakeholder process and have submitted in the CPUC process. But we recognize that not everyone may be following the CAISO process, and so wanted to sort of level set and remind folks about where we've been with these issues. So go to the next slide. So an unforced capacity construct ensures resources capacity values reflect their availability. So UCAP promotes procurement of the most dependable and reliable resources upfront by accounting for historic unavailability in their capacity values. So the current PRM, forced outage substitution rules, and RAIM have proven inadequate to replace capacity on forced outage. So moving to a UCAP construct would allow the ISO to also eliminate complicated and ineffective forced outage substitution rules. Another advantage of UCAP is that UCAP dynamically changes with the fleet's forced outage rate. So this is something that's calculated annually. And so rather than relying on the PRM, which is a static value, which could lead to over or under procurement if future outage rates change more or less than what's currently assumed in the PRM. So under UCAP, the PRM would no longer need to explicitly account for forced outage rates, and the 4 to 6% that is currently included in the 15% planning reserve margin could be removed, and the PRM would only need to cover operating reserves and forecast error and any other additional reserves we wanted to include to account for some of the exceedance methodology choices that we talked about last. But under UCAP, forced outage rates would no longer need to be explicitly accounted for in the PRM. Next slide. So there's a couple different ways to calculate a UCAP value. The CAISO is proposing a seasonal availability factor methodology to determine UCAP values.
So in prior comments in this proceeding, the CAISO recommended using the seasonal average availability factor approach for UCAP determinations during the tightest system conditions by looking at the hourly RA supply cushion. So resource availability factors would incorporate historic force and urgent outage and D rates to determine the resource's expected future availability and their contributions to reliability. So we've outlined here a basic UCAP methodology that can be used for dispatchable thermal resources. And we recognize that this baseline methodology may not be appropriate for all resource types and plan to provide recommendations on augmented methodologies to consider during the next workshop. Next slide. So this resource availability can be calculated on a seasonal basis and measured on tight RA supply cushion hours. So this approach considers the different impacts of availability during seasons across the year to better reflect unit reliability. Additionally, by looking at RA supply cushion hours, when it is a low RA supply cushion, this indicates the system has fewer assets available to react to unexpected outages or load increases, and indicates high real-time system resource adequacy risk. This methodology would also capture how tight the system would be if we only had the RA fleet to rely on. And so in this methodology, we make no assumptions about other excess economic energy that may be available, because with tightening conditions across the West, it may no longer be a viable assumption or prudent design of the RA program to assume that there might be excess energy to rely on under tight system conditions. Next slide. So how we're defining the RA supply cushion is that we would be looking at the daily shown RA, excluding wind and solar, and then netting out planned outages, opportunity outages, urgent and forced outages, serving net load, and contingency reserves. So what the RA supply cushion represents is how much shown RA megawatts are left over after we take into account meeting all the outages, serving that demand, and covering contingency reserves. And here we're defining contingency reserves as representing reg up, spin, and non-spinning reserves. And the way that we've constructed this, and because net load is on a 5-minute basis, to convert this to an hourly measure, we're planning to take an average of the 5-minute RA supply cushion for each of the 12 RTT intervals to get a representative operating hour. Next slide. So once we have calculated the RA supply cushion for each hour, we only think you need to look at a subset of those hours to capture the tightest grid conditions. And so we propose that you could look at somewhere between the top 15 and 20% of the tightest RA supply cushion hours. And so in our own stakeholder process, we had been in the process of discussing whether we should look at 15 or 20% of RA supply cushion hours, but recognized that we needed better data to make a more informed choice. And so the CAISO is currently working with our development team to collect the data to calculate the RA supply cushion for the last 3 years. And we plan to provide this data during the UCAP workshop on January 19th in this series to provide a better assessment of how many hours to look at. But again, we recommend that you look at the forced outage rates under a subset of hours that represent the hours of greatest RA supply risk. And the advantage of this overall approach is that it captures the forced outage rates under conditions when the grid really needed the resource. So it values an outage during, the net load peak on a hot summer day higher than it would, say, in the middle of the night when we have 20,000 excess megawatts in the system. So it does a good job of capturing outage rates when we were expecting the resource to be available. These assessment hours can fall at any point in the day, however, and so the resources are incentivized to always be available because they won't know in advance when a UCAP assessment hour is, and so there'll be greater incentive to invest in good utility practices and maintenance to make sure that the resources are available. This methodology is simpler than an E4D methodology, which is used by some of the other ISOs and RTOs to calculate UCAP. It would allow the ISO to utilize our OMS data rather than setting up new systems to collect GADS data, which is what we've heard from some resource owners is a complicated data set to produce for them. It also provides consistency across evaluation periods by using a % of hours. And it also allows resource owners to have a more predictable risk of any one outage on their resource's capacity value, because you know how many hours up front, and so you can make better assumptions about how any one outage might be affecting your future UCAP values. And then the preliminary data that we have looked at indicated that the observations fall on a majority of days and covers a large enough sample size and tended to be concentrated in hours of greatest need, meaning the net load, ramp, and peak hours. Again, at the January workshop, we'll provide data to confirm those preliminary observations and to have more explicit discussions about what this methodology looks like. Next slide. So again, we're proposing this on a seasonal basis. However, these seasons selected to calculate UCAP values can be aligned with slice of day, and so whatever seasons slice of day framework ultimately selects, UCAP could be augmented to capture those same seasons. So for instance, PG&E has in prior proposals suggested anywhere from 2 to 4 to 3 seasons. And so UCAP could be modified to, for each of those seasons, have a different UCAP value. And then if the slice of day framework elected to retain the monthly showings as suggested by SCE's proposal, CAISO could calculate UCAP for up to 2 seasons, because we did notice some differential patterns between peak and off-peak months, and apply UCAP from those seasons to the relevant month. So in prior proposals, the CAISO had proposed to calculate seasonal UCAP values for peak months of May through October, and then off-peak months of November through April. So again, if we went with a monthly construct, we would likely go with these 2 seasons. However, again, UCAP can be augmented to match whatever seasons are ultimately selected under the slice of day framework. Next slide. So here I provide the sort of a basic understanding of the steps to go from identifying the UCAP assessment hours to a resource's UCAP value. And then the appendix provide the actual formulas if folks are interested. But in a nutshell, first step would be to determine the UCAP assessment hours by identifying which hours fall into the top % of tightest RA supply cushion hours for each season. So again, the steps that I just walked through would then lead to the sampling frame. And then the next step would be to determine the hourly unavailability factors by looking at the force and urgent outages for the resource for each UCAP assessment hours for each season. Then we would be calculating the seasonal average availability factors by using 1 minus the average HUFs for that each season for each year. So this converts it from an unavailability to an availability factor. And then we're proposing to look at outage rates over the last years and looking to weight the most recent years higher. And so we would take the seasonal average availability factor for each year and then weight the first year 45%, the second year 35%, and the third year 25%. You add these weights up, and then you would be then applying this resulting weighted seasonal average availability factor to the deliverable capacity of the resource to determine the monthly or seasonal NQC value for each resource. Next slide. And so the CAISO thinks that the UCAP could be incorporated into our NQC process. And so we're imagining conducting a 2-step process to assess resources QC values that include the resource deliverability and availability. So step 1, we would conduct our resource deliverability assessments and adjust the qualifying capacity for deliverability, which would then result in a deliverable capacity for the resource. The next step would be to apply the non-availability factors to the DQC to produce a resulting NQC value for the resource. So again, under this framework, we would still be contracting in terms, or capacity values would still be expressed in terms of NQC, which has addressed some stakeholder concerns around existing contracts. But then the must offer obligation for resources would be in terms of the deliverable capacity. And so by requiring resources to bid above what their NQC value is, this produces the pool of resources that are used to substitute when other resources are on outage. So again, if you're valuing a resource, say 100 megawatt resource, it's deliverable at 90 megawatts, but its UCAP value or NQC is at 80 megawatts. By requiring them to bid in at 90 megawatts on all times, this produces 10 extra megawatts that the system can use to substitute for other resources that happen to be on outage during that hour. And so that's how UCAP creates a forced outage substitution pool and allows you to take forced outage rates out of the PRM. So with that, that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So I'm going to have to stop sharing the screen because I cannot see who's in queue. We do have a number of hands that are raised. Wow, it's almost the same exact ones that I lowered the hands. The first one I see, again, I'm going to go by what's on my screen here, and I don't know if this is in order when people raise their hands, but Tom Beach.
Eric, I think that maybe yours is, it just hasn't refreshed for some reason, maybe because you were sharing your screen. I see Mark.
Okay. That's
yeah, Eric, I don't have a question, and I thought I lowered my hand.
Okay, that's interesting because I went through and lowered the hands of everybody that I saw remaining on the last one. So let me, I don't know what's happening here.
I had that issue too, Eric, just FYI, because I tried lowering some hands and then they would lower and then come back.
Okay.
Doesn't seem to work that well. But, so the first hand that I saw was Mark Specht.
Mark, okay, that's what I thought because the other ones look like repeats from earlier. So Mark Specht, go ahead.
Great, thanks. Just a couple questions for you, Bridget. To clarify mostly, is this just for thermal resources, or would this also be applied to other types of resources as well? And then I'll actually just ask my second question as well. Is the idea that UCAP would be used in place of exceedance methodology, or like, okay, I got a nod from you. I'll just let you answer, thanks.
Yeah, so your first answer is the methodology that we outlined here is specifically for dispatchable thermal resources. In next week's presentation or next workshop's presentation, we have thought about how to apply UCAP for storage and other resource types. And so we'll provide more details about how you could augment the methodology to apply to these other resource types. Or we could just apply UCAP to thermal resources. So in this presentation, it's just talking about thermals, but we have contemplated how to apply UCAP to all resource types. And we'll provide more of those details next workshop. And again, we're imagining that UCAP would be in place of an exceedance methodology, and it would make sense to have the CPUC still keep thermals at their Pmax and then allow the CAISO's process to derate the unit because UCAP will capture things like thermal derates, plant maintenance outages, et cetera. And so the only exemptions we've contemplated so far are for transmission-induced outages and like unit testing. There's a few other exemptions that I can provide next workshop, but by and large, it should capture all of the reasons and similar to why you of things you might capture in the exceedance methodology. So I think would be an either or, not a both, to keep it simple.
Got it. Thank you.
So Mark, are you still with Union of Concerned Scientists?
Yes, I am. Thanks.
Thanks. If I can just ask folks when they ask their question, if they can introduce themselves and the organization that they're representing, that would be helpful. Thank you, Mark. The next I have is Matt Barmack.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Matt.
Hey, this is Matt Barmack with Calpine. I had a few clarifying questions, I think maybe similar to Mark's, and it's been so long since I've looked at your proposal. I kind of forget some of the details, but can you just remind me, you said you'd be talking the next workshop about how UCAP might apply to storage, but how does this work with exceedance for renewables, would the force, sort of like with the LCC, would the forced outages be in the sort of the profiles that are used to calculate exceedance, or would they be removed and then you'd apply them, sort of reapply them to calculate UCAP?
Yeah, so in prior proposals, we had been assuming that wind and solar would be using an ELCC methodology. And because that's already sufficiently derated and includes things like forced outages, we wouldn't be applying additional derates for UCAP. So in prior proposals, we've said that UCAP for wind and solar would just be their ELCC values. I think depending on how we propose to modify that and how well we think forced outage rates are represented in either the exceedance, or if we continue to use some variant of ELCC, we likely wouldn't be applying UCAP explicitly to those resources, and just would be, if we felt that outage rates were sufficiently covered in these other methodologies, you wouldn't need to do an additional UCAP. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And the second question, I mean, I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And this is sort of related to something that's been proposed in MISO, but I was wondering if you'd ever thought about sort of calculating availability in a way that reflects not just forced outages, but might reflect things like use limits being exhausted, or an inflexible unit not being committed and therefore not actually available in real time during a tight supply cushion hour. I'm just wondering if you thought of sort of broadening the definition of availability to get at some of these other factors.
So our UCAP will capture things like use limitation reached. So if you go back, I think this is in the 6th revised SHA proposal, we do have a list of the nature of work cards that are included in UCAP, and it does include things like use limitations reached,
okay,
sort of the whole gamut. The thing that we don't contemplate right now is that situation where, a long start resources wasn't committed day ahead, and therefore aren't available in real time.
Yeah.
We sort of make the assumption that the day ahead market will do a reasonable job of scheduling all the resources we need. And so that's just a simplifying assumption we make. So we don't capture that. We sort of assume that that's more of a market function, not necessarily the fault of the resource. You could start thinking about looking at bids, but it gets more complicated. So we try to keep it simple and just think of availability as if you're on forced outage or not, meaning you're physically capable, and assume that the markets do a reasonable job of scheduling resources to meet demand in real time.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful.
Thank you, Matt. The next one I see on the list is Doug Carpa.
Yeah, hi. I think this is just a clarification question, just to make sure that I understand this correctly. I think the answer is yes. So by calculating the outage rates on an hourly basis for those particularly high load times and including thermal derates, that really is going to capture the correlation of particularly thermal derates with really high temperatures. Like it gets really hot, everybody turns on their air conditioning, that's when peak loads are, and that correlation of thermal, yeah, I'm seeing lots of nodding. Okay, awesome, because that's always been a concern that that we need to capture that resources that go out specifically when we most need them. And then kind of on the flip side though, what it would not capture, or maybe it would, depending on what's going on a monthly basis, would be the kind of the Dunkelflaute problem that if we see, weather-related derates, essentially, particularly of solar because of cloudy conditions. I'm looking out my window today. Those probably would not be correlated with high usage times. So that wouldn't, like, if we were to apply this to solar on the theme of equal footing, it probably would not pick up on that issue because those don't happen under high peak conditions.
Yeah, that might be a limitation of this methodology. And like I said, in the January 19th workshop, we'll provide tables where it shows you where the UCAP assessment hours are falling, and you can more clearly see the correlation between things like high load days, or sorry, higher temperature days would probably also be high UCAP assessment hour days. And so I'll provide some of that sort of breakdown so that you can kind of better see, sort of the patterns of when UCAP assessment hours tend to fall. And in what I've looked at so far, I would say that that's a fair correlation that we could probably explicitly test if you wanted, but it did seem to do a good job of, oversampling on really hot days, and, maybe undersampling on more mild days, because again, loads were lower, so we had more cushion out there. But yeah, the idea behind the supply cushion is that it is trying to capture some of those sort of co-correlating events on the grid to then, when we see similar conditions, we would expect, at least especially the thermal D rates to be similar in the future.
Great, very elegant. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Doug. Nick Pappas.
You're on mute, Nick.
Of course I am. Thanks. Hey, thanks, Eric and Bridget. Nick Pappas here on behalf of NRDC. Bridget, great presentation. Some of the discussion today around thermal resources and renewables and UCAP versus exceedance, I've been thinking about how to sort of balance those two. So both, UCAP and exceedance have this relationship with the PRM where you're sort of specifying or socializing risk and how you define the parameters. And I'm trying to think about, as you think about those two sets of resources, is there a way to sort of conceptually balance how much we're specifying risk for renewables and exceedance and thermal and UCAP so that they have similar level of split between sort of resource specified and socialized in the PRM, since the PRM is going to sort of apply uniformly to both? Have you given any thought to that dynamic, or how to think about how to balance those inputs, those parameters?
Not explicitly, because again, I think when we were designing UCAP, we were making the assumption that wind and solar would still be on ELCC, and we felt that they were sufficiently derated that, probably in the most critical hours, they're, overcounted, but then undercounted in others. And so on the balance, and especially as we get more and more on the system, ELCC values are getting lower and lower. And so we felt that, there was sufficient enough resources on the grid to account for that you maybe didn't need to increase the PRM to capture that. Under this new slice of day framework, I definitely think that's a point we need to think about and kind of balance between. But just, kind of thinking about we don't necessarily, under UCAP, you wouldn't need to also include forced outage rates on thermal, which, is still a good chunk of the fleet. And so, maybe we add 1 or 2% to account for the solar ELCC, wind ELCC uncertainty, or pick a higher forecast level, so move to 1 and 5 to maybe also kind of help give a larger cushion to help, kind of balance between simplicity and, risk tolerances. So I think that's a good question for us to think about more.
Thank you. Okay, sorry, names are cropping up back in the list here, so I need to make sure. Doug, you got your question answered, correct?
Yeah, I'm just being lazy and slow.
That's okay. And I think, Matt, you requeued, correct?
No, I tried to take my hand down.
Okay. All right. And so I'm sorry, I'm losing my mind here. I thought that last question came from Kathleen Colbert. Colbert, am I misremembering? Because it's quite possible I am.
I haven't jumped in yet.
Okay, then Kathleen, you're up.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. This is Kathleen Colbert, and I'm trying to be good housekeeping. So from Vistra. And Bridget, thanks for the presentation. I know you've been talking, Kaisa's been bringing this up for a while, so but it was a really good refresher since it has been sometimes we talked about it, so I appreciate it a lot. I have kind of two concerns generally, which leads me to two questions that I was hoping you could talk a little bit about. My first is, and I say, I'm actually gonna, Carrie put this comment relative to exceedance in the chat, but about whether or not history is a good predictor for future conditions. And that is something that I'd say that Vistra, as just like a company, like we have a belief that historical events may not be a good predictor for the future. So with that kind of the anchoring on our concern, your proposal, I put this in the chat, so I'm just gonna throw it out here. So instead of having to respond to it, the top percent of tightest supply cushion hours that we have seen historically, I'm just concerned may not be a good predictor of the top percent of tightest supply cushion hours in the future, especially, and just to kind of flesh out my scenario of why this is something that I think is really important to talk about, is that, with climate change impacts and shifts in kind of usage and demand, I'm seeing an increasing trend that future conditions, fundamentals are not tracking what we consider heuristics or how history has necessarily behaved as our climate and our economies evolve. And so I do think it's really important. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about what the CAISO proposes, maybe a risk mitigation approach to control for that concern.
Yeah, so I guess I disagree with the assertion that history isn't a decent predictor of the future. So if you look at what's the alternative to that, is that you take it at no discount. So I guess my point back is, then what else do you do to try to determine and predict future resource performance? So we know that Pmax is probably going to be the worst predictor of what the resource can provide, because it doesn't make any account for things like thermal derates, outages, all these other things. And so our perspective is that, it's a known statistical principle that the expected value, the best predictor of that is the mean. And so this methodology helps calculate a mean of resources historic availability under the most critical conditions historically. And so while yes, I may not be able to give you 100% prediction in any 1 hour what the resources availability is going to be, I bet you I will be closer with a UCAP estimation of, say, whatever their average historic availability is, than you would be going with Pmax. And so I guess my point back is, yes, the future is always unknown. There's always going to be uncertainty, but with a large enough sample size, robust enough data, I think you're going to get a better guess by using UCAP or historic exceedance than you would under any other methodology. Also, I think because we're going to do UCAP on an annual basis, looking back the last 3 years, I think you're going to get a good sample of different conditions for different resource types to give you a pretty robust estimation of when the resource is under similar conditions, especially for things like temperature, what you would expect the resources to be outputted on. Again, if they also have frequent plant trouble outage cards, then those would be picked up. And so, you would recognize that this resource maybe isn't good at maintaining its resource. And so it's likely going to have continued resource trouble in the future. However, if they do start investing and do upgrades, because we're only looking back 3 years, that bad historic performance will fall off, and its new resource or operating history will be, again, weighted more heavily. And so I think we've tried to balance all these different ways you could see it. And then again, if you still are uncomfortable with, how well this methodology is doing, then you can always beef up the PRM and add additional cushionage. And so that's kind of been our take, and what we think is, more robust than other methodology you might have out there. But again, nobody can predict the future. So, we're kind of relying on tried and true statistical methods to give us, the best estimation. And I don't think on a year-to-year basis, you'll see quite big swings. You'll start to see, trends of, droughts in California lasting longer and longer, hotter weather in the summer. And so I think since we're only looking back 3 years, that's a better predictor than if we were using like 20 years of data. Yes, those models are probably not as representative of future conditions, but because we're looking so close in time, I don't think you're going to see drastic changes in weather over a 3-year horizon necessarily.
That's really helpful. So 2 suggestions for you to think about. And also clarify, my question is very specific to the hours rather than the general concept of UCAP. I don't have a position to share at this point. I think that looking back 3 years could be fine if you looked at every hour, but I don't even think that is the best approach. I think you asked if we had a suggestion or a vision of how it would be the best way to go about identifying the hours for you to do the assessment. And my view is, in tying back to our presentation we gave at the last workshop about how we believe a loss of load expectation study that identifies loss of load probability hours is a really important part of the future structural change. Once you have the loss of load probability hours, those hours are the hours that we have shown from a more rigorous modeling have risks. And so I think if you wanted to narrow the hours within the 3 years, at least you're using something that is based on future modeling that can be probabilistic. And I think that sounds more rigorous than looking at historical events. Just a suggestion to consider. My second concern is, challenges with the new 100% planned outage substitution obligation. And I think I also raised that risk in my presentation about planned outage without substitution. And I understand that they do get, converted if they have to be taken into forced outages under your current rules. But is there a way to, rather than taking that approach, to try to move away from 100% planned outage substitution for outages that cannot be replaced, but have it be reflected in your proposal so that it isn't, so that it's being valued, but that we can move away from this overly restrictive 100% postal world. Can you talk a little bit about that or take that back to the team?
So I got your suggestion right. So you're suggesting, in addition to looking at forced outages, potentially also looking at planned outages that aren't substituted for and including that in UCAP. And then.
Well, so in practice, you're going to include them because when you submit a planned outage and you cannot find replacement, it's canceled. Mm-hmm. And then you go about supporting that it has to be taken. And then it's converted into a forced outage, even though it was really submitted in the planned horizon. And I think that that is a data transparency issue on one hand. I'm not sure that it is a UCAP issue, but it is a huge risk. It's a different risk of substitution risk. It's not a forced outage risk where an event occurs that could not be anticipated and then a forced outage has to occur. Planned outages without substitution are, they're more a result of the driver that we're really tight in our system than it is that something unexpected happened to the resource. So in that instance, it's not an indicator. So you would be including it under this proposal because it's converted to forced, but it may not be an indicator that this resource is a dud, to put it that way. It may just be an indicator that maintenance has to happen regularly and substitution wasn't available because we're shortcut. And so I think that kind of keeping them separate from a data perspective is helpful, but also recognizing that they don't necessarily mean. So I think that I don't know yet if I don't have a position. I just wondered if you had thought about it and the complexity of this issue relative to UCAP.
Okay. So one thought back to that is we are proposing to realign the outage definitions with the RC definitions. And with that comes a new outage category called urgent outages, which are identified after the planned horizon, but are they're sort of considered like first in the priority stack, and they're indicating that the resource isn't broken yet, but it is at risk of breaking, and they need to go off to do critical maintenance. And so I think the urgent outage category starts to capture the idea that you're talking about in terms of it's maintenance that needs to be taken, but again, the unit isn't tripped offline kind of conception. And so it starts to get closer at that idea. I do think the CAISO is, still considering policy to help ease the burden of finding substitute capacity for planned outages. And so, there may be other mechanisms we can do that to help ease that rather than putting it into the UCAP construct. But I can definitely take that back to the team to think about further. So thank you.
Thanks.
Other thing to think about is in January, we will have the hourly RE supply cushions and give you the distribution of when UCAP assessment hours will be. And what I found is they're highly correlated with what we typically identify as the loss of load expectation hours. But one of the reasons why we went with this methodology is that loss of load expectation hours are known upfront by the resource, and so they can sort of game their UCAP values by avoiding outages in those hours. And so whereas UCAP, there's always sort of this, you don't know with 100% certainty whether or not the hour will be a UCAP assessment hour, and so you're more incentivized to keep your resource operational during all conditions, not just sort of these loss of load expectations. So that's one of the reasons why this methodology, again, I think will capture majority of UCAP assessment hours will be in those loss of load expectation hours, because those are also when the RA supply cushion should be the lowest, if not negative. And so I think once we get more data, hopefully it can help alleviate some of these concerns around the robustness of the methodology and is it selecting the right hours that you would kind of expect or want to sample on. So definitely look forward to giving that data out to stakeholders for further discussion and consideration. So thanks, Kathleen, for your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. And one last follow-up question to what you said to Matt about the use limited reach cards. Has the CAISO changed? I mean, so under at least the initial implementation rules, use limited reach cards were exempt from rain through the month that it was submitted and only exposed to rain the following month. When you said that it would be accounted for in the UCAP, are you saying that you would remove that kind of deference? So like, for example, monthly use limited reach cards are exempt because they're only monthly?
No, right now the proposal is all use limitation reach cards would be eligible for UCAP, so they would be counted.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I'm gonna try to move us along here. I've got two more people in the queue and I've got one question myself. So let's go through those last three, and then if there's any further, we'll have to get it in the catch up. So Noah?
Hey, Bridget, this is Noah Tom from Middle River Power. Quick question for you. So I think the one thing that you've highlighted, which is the top 15 or 20 percentile of hours within a season, I think my concern is that those sort of top 15 or 20% is not relative to the system need, in the sense that if there's still sufficient capacity after outages are accounted for, even beyond the planning reserve margin in a particular month or season, that those hours were then accounted or counted against a resource's UCAP value. Can you talk a little bit more about how your calculation on the 15 to 20% is sort of established, and whether or not it would only look at things with when it gets below a current 15% planning reserve margin, or even higher?
Okay, so we had considered that kind of methodology of selecting a specific supply cushion threshold where we would only count hours if it fell below some megawatt threshold. So the reason we moved away from that kind of methodology is what happens when you get into periods where you have no hours that fall below that. So you have no UCAP calculated for that season, or you only have 1 or 2 hours that fall below that, so that the resources UCAP value is way overrepresented by a really small sample set. So one of the advantages of using a percent of hours, and I will say this, how many hours we look at is still an open question and hasn't been completely resolved. And what we hope that data will help provide more clarity on are we oversampling? Are we getting too many hours where the supply cushion is relatively large? And so maybe we can only look at like 10% would be a reasonable assessment. So how many hours we look at is still kind of an open question, but the reason why we went with a % of hours is because it would give us consistency across evaluation periods. It would ensure that you have a sufficiently large data set to calculate this so that you do get, robust means to have, reasonable predictors of the future. And so it's not just, the sampling frame and the RA assessment hours are trying to, again, give us a snapshot of the resources availability under conditions that we are concerned about. But again, balancing the need to have sufficiently large data sets to be able to produce a robust UCAP methodology. And so that's, the reason we went with this methodology. Again, how many hours we look at, maybe 10% is more reasonable because, 15% cutoffs tend to be too high in the supply stack. So, we could lower it. So like those kinds of questions, we can still kind of massage a little bit to get, make sure that we're getting, good representative hours that we would be concerned about in the future. But I think the idea that it should just be a set megawatt threshold is the wrong way to go and leads to, I think it's the wrong design to produce robust. And I think, more of these concerns that people are talking about in terms of like how predictable is this UCAP value on future conditions. I think the methodology that you might be suggesting would, raise those even further. Whereas, having this % set sampling frame, I think will lead to better estimations.
I guess I haven't seen that data to suggest whether or not one threshold versus another is better or worse or right or wrong. It just seems that a variable sort of design on the threshold it seems I guess unpredictable, especially if there may not be a need or harm to the system. Second question is, how do you think it would UCAP would be designed for slices of the day? Would each slice get its own UCAP value, or were you more thinking of it's a singular value for all slices of the day?
We were imagining a single value for all slices. So again, since we're looking at, UCAP assessment hours can fall any day or any hour, then, and especially since this is for dispatchable thermals, they should reasonably be available in all slices. And so at least for thermals, we're imagining a single UCAP value for all slices.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you, Noah. And actually, I had a question, and it's actually on that very point. So the only concern I have with doing that is that if we're looking at a subset of hours to determine what their RA value is, and we're moving to a system in which we say the excess amount of capacity serves as energy to be able to charge a battery. Then are we looking at potentially a situation in which those resources could provide more energy in other hours to charge a battery that is needed for some other place? I think I'm more comfortable if the UCAP was established on an average of all 24 hours, because then on any given hour, it may have a likelihood of doing that. But if we think it's more likely to have outages during certain hours and less likely to have them during other hours, then do we have to move UCAP to either look at slices or individual hours?
So you could just calculate the average outage rate on all hours. So conceivably you could do that, or, there's always the option to lower the NQC value. So if, as a contracting LLC, if you felt like the resources was still overcounted because, it's never available from 1 to 5 because of a environmental or a sound limit, there's nothing to prevent you from not counting that resource in those hours. So, you still could consider additional D rates beyond just UCAP to account for those kinds of things. Or if we really felt that a 24-hour assessment was really important. Another way you could potentially do this is then weight it by the RA supply cushion. So you'd still be weighting hours of critical grid need higher, but you would still be looking at all hours. So that's another way we could consider it. But again, I think for, especially for dispatchable generation that's, theoretically available 24/7, UCAP helps capture, when that assumption isn't necessarily the best one to make. And, again, I think kind of when the hours fall, I think the data will help, further either give people more comfort or help identify additional modifications we need to make to UCAP. And so I think, waiting to see the data will help, kind of answer some of these more specific questions. But again, we were imagining that, UCAP would just be applicable for all slices, but it doesn't include resource owners from, in their contracting with LSCs to say, you can't count me in slice 1 because I have a, air quality limit, and, it doesn't necessarily have to be reflected in the QC value, but it could be counted for in the, the slice accounting.
Okay, thank you, Bridget. Okay, so we're at the time that we're at. I want to ask a question, see what people would prefer that we do. Nick's presentation is scheduled for 45 minutes. That would put us right at 1 o'clock. And if we were going to do that, then we would want to take a lunch break immediately afterwards and come back for questions. Or the alternative is we could take a lunch break now and come back at 1:45 and move on from there. However, I know that people might have scheduled meetings at 1, seeing that this may have been ending at 1 o'clock. So can I see by folks using the raise hand feature, who would prefer that we just continue on right now? And if we need to take a lunch break at 1, we will do so. Okay. All right, and if those folks could lower their hands again. All right, and let's look at that then the opposite way. And let me ask the question, if we were to take a lunch break now and come back in a half an hour and continue on with the rest of it, preference for that, raised hands. Okay, I seem to be seeing far more raised hands for taking a lunch break right now and then coming back. I didn't, there isn't really a more than 50% of the people on the call who voted either way, but Nick, are you, I know you said you might have a meeting at 1, but yours are flexible. Are you okay with coming back in at 12:45 and beginning then?
Yep, Eric, no problem. I'll move my afternoon stuff.
Okay, let's do that then, folks. We're going to take a half an hour break and we will come back at 12:45. Thank you.